This video is about Homer, and of course Homer is huge and it's about everything, and I've read over the Iliad and the Odyssey many times, um, and I've decided just to keep it to what I think are the main points and um, let other scholars add to my approach. I think I have a different approach. It's hard to know because so much has been written and a lot of the scholarship is so specialized you can't tell from reading the articles if they would agree or disagree with my general approach. But so I've given up on trying to read everything. And I'm going to link it to what I've said before and what I'm going to say in the future. So it will all be a part of the greater whole, and then admittedly by a person who is a Plato scholar and a tour guide, not a Homer scholar. Um, my main point here is that around 800 BC, in Delphi, Olympia, Hesiod, and Homer, there, in all four of those instances, there seems to have been this um, emergence of a higher level of self conscious awareness and the conscious awareness of political association and the difference between political association and less sophisticated association. So, what I think happened in the minds of Homer and Hesiod, who just represent storytellers, and we have no idea how many storytellers there actually were, but I think what happened was just as Hesiod made that distinction between particulars and universals, and the poet is the one that understands the universal, there was also this conscious awareness that there's a different kind of association between people that's at a higher level than people have been aware of before, or that this particular people was aware of. So previously, people, as Aristotle said, people are bound together in families biologically, and then they come together to live better. So the village is the way people associate in order to survive more comfortably, and also to some extent protect themselves from outside threats. But then there's this higher level of association, which is people who don't know each other living together under a common body of laws, political association. And Aristotle emphasizes so much that this kind of association is for the sake of a good life, not mere life. You have to have that level of association to provide enough security, stability, and community so that people have leisure time to pursue the arts, the sciences, and to develop a high quality of life. So that's what I'm going to emphasize here is I think Homer is with Hesiod in this recognition of this higher level of existence, social evolution. Um, the other thing that I want to point out in the way that I read Homer, I read it as following the criteria in Aristotle's Poetics. This is not, I'm very aware that Aristotle lived many centuries later, but I think he was simply describing the whole tradition that he came from. And also, this particular, the Poetics is structured in a way to educate nous, the highest power, and this was what Hesiod and Homer were also trying to do, is educate what I call rational intuition or mind. So when we read Homer, we should keep in mind all of these elements. First of all, It concerns universals, not particulars. So these stories were invented, created hundreds of years after the actual Trojan War, and everybody knew that. So they're not interested in facts. They're interested in types, in patterns. Second of all, the purpose of the literature is to teach or to educate. And you educate by making analogies. So we don't have to obsess about whether Achilles really lived, whether these people lived. We don't have to obsess about whether they really had this wife or that wife, whether they really did this thing or that thing. What we have to think about and talk about is, what was the poet trying to express? What's the lesson the poet was trying to teach by telling us this story? And make analogies with their own experience. If we can't make analogies, it's worthless. The point is to educate. The poem or the story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even though the Iliad and the Odyssey are huge, for example, in the Iliad, it at the first third, at the end of a third of the way in, was when Agamemnon gives back Briseis to Achilles, and then Achilles still doesn't join the fight, and then 2/3 of the way through, he finally does, and that's the climax of the book, I believe. I'll argue, and so you have that pattern of complication and unraveling. And so I'll point that out when I talk about it. Then the number one factor in the Iliad is the plot, is the sequence of events. And of course there are many events and many choices. So there's many different situations where there are critical moments and people have to make decisions, and they become happy or unhappy based on their choices. That's what Aristotle says. Everybody has good opinions. Definitely in the Iliad, everybody's got a reason for doing most the wrong thing, or for the wrong reason, the right thing for the wrong reason, or the wrong thing for the right reason, but usually the wrong thing for the wrong reason, in the wrong way, at the wrong time. And that's what leads to happiness or unhappiness. The characters are good, right? They aren't super wicked. They're people that people can identify with. They have good opinions, and they're consistent. Their character is consistent, so it has to be people we can identify with. The characters are related to each other. Aristotle emphasizes that they belong to these certain aristocratic families. In the Iliad, they do. I mean, the federation of city-states of the Achaeans is led by the families in each city-state, and then in the Trojans, it's Priam and his family. But the big issue here is that the stories are trying to bind people together at a higher level, a level of political association. And this is the main point, I think, of the Iliad, that the purpose of the war was to regain the legitimacy and the dignity and the trust of hospitality agreements, or basically of oaths, or the rule of law between city-states. Because Paris broke that, the hospitality agreement, and the Achaeans had the just cause. So they were right. But the trouble is, right from the beginning of the Iliad, they don't even think that's the reason they're fighting. Achilles accuses Agamemnon of fighting just to protect his family. Agamemnon does not correct him. And so basically, there's not one just action in the whole book because nothing anybody does is for the right reason. Nothing is done to protect hospitality agreements and the international or intercity rule of law. So this is shocking, and I do think this is a major theme, and I'm going to argue that based on Aristotle and also based on Hesiod, what he says in his works and days. Um, so he says the plot is the number one issue, and so we have to figure out the many, 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 many ways people get it wrong. There's degrees of wrong, but there's not one just action in the whole story. It's just that you know why. You sort out why, and then you educate yourself about how to act, how to avoid war, how to act in the context of war, and you learn it by watching people do things wrong so that you tell yourself, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make that mistake. Okay, the next thing are the characters. And the characters in the Iliad and Odyssey, Aristotle says they're intermediate characters. They're not particularly good and not particularly wicked. Again, they're people you can identify with. And I would argue that they are. Achilles, yeah, he's stronger than the average, whatever. But anybody can identify with him and try to imitate him. Or if they realize this is a story about what not to do, they can understand the temptation to, to act like Achilles did, but to resist his continual way of overreacting. And the same with the other characters. Then thought is always an issue in the text. They're always telling you why to do it. And so the Iliad is absolutely chock full of people engaged in what Aristotle called deliberation. And the deliberation process is it's about, we decide how to act in the realm of experience or the realm of reality that's not set in stone. It doesn't occur by necessity. It occurs by human choice. So human beings create history and culture, but they don't have the power to create anything. There are limits. There are natural limits, and there are human limits, and so the book shows you all the ways people overstep their bounds and try to go outside the limit, and they pay the price, or somebody pays the price. So there's the object of wish, is what's the goal, and that's the most important part of deliberation, and that's what nobody ever says. That the goal is to regain the legitimacy of hospitality agreements. There are many oaths, taken or not taken, in the Iliad, so there's this constant reminder and constant model of oath taking. There's also most important ways that those oaths are either broken, like Paris breaks his promise, or at a critical moment Achilles refuses to make a covenant, a law between he and Hector. So that's a big question. And then in the process of deliberation, there's the object of wish, and then people deliberate about, well, sure, everybody wants world peace, but what are our options right now? In this particular situation, we have X, Y, Z. We have 3 or 4 choices. Then they deliberate which is the best choice and why. Okay, and you can talk about each character perceives the situation differently, is blind to certain options, doesn't even consider certain options, or considers some things options that aren't options. And I I did start to write about the Iliad and include all of Aristotle's categories at one point, but it would take absolutely forever. So it's just an intuitive process, and the educational system is oral. So it makes complete sense to me that a bard would recite Homer at a festival, and then people after the recitation would go to a taverna and talk about it, because that is how it educates. It doesn't educate as much, it's not a written tradition. Even when you teach it, it's much better to teach it in a seminar setting and have a conversation. It's not about memorizing, it's about engaging. Um, okay, and then once you make your choice in the process of deliberation, if you're good at deliberation, you're good at setting out the object of wish, you're good at setting out what the attainable options are, you're good at picking the one that really is best, you're good at explaining why it's best, and then you're good at commanding others, convincing other people, inspiring other people to actually do what's best. Um, and so, again, there's so many ways the process can break down. Um, so, the other issue that comes up a lot is the relationship that people have. So, supposedly, the Federation of Tribes, or Federation of City States, is really bound together by the rule of law, international law, or agreements. But what happens is, at a certain point, they come together to decide how to inspire the troops. And Nestor, the old guy, recommends that you organize them in their tribes. And then when they say why they're fighting, 2/3 of the way through, they say, well, I'm fighting for the honor of my city state, or to receive honor from my city state. And that's a lower level of social evolution. It just shows they could get it together. So they started out not being organized by city state or tribe. They started out, look, it's about hospitality agreements. But they couldn't sustain it because they lost it. They lost the entire point. Yeah, okay, we don't do that anymore. I understand this. Okay, so it's the imitation of an action. Um, and the purpose, the point, is a catharsis of pity and fear. Okay, a flushing out, right? Okay, so the word pity in Greek is pathos. And I've talked to a number of Greeks and scholars, and I've read a lot about what that means. So I will, then they disagree. But one thing pathos is pathological, passive, as opposed to eros. Eros is creative and positive. And then thanatos is the death wish, it's violence. It's the really dark side. So pathos is just being passive, getting in a situation. And one of my Greek friends said it's just about having this flood of emotions, all of them irrational. And yeah, that's what happens to the characters. And so it's the main point there is that audience members can identify with this. They understand it. And so it's people who are consumed by pathological emotions. They feel victimized, or they want to react, overreact. It's all sorts of excesses, extremes in Aristotle's view. And so a catharsis is a flushing out. It's a medical term that doctors used when they drank the you had a stomach ache. And I said this on the section on Aristotle. You have diarrhea, you throw up. and you get rid of those passive emotions and fear. So pathos and phobos, catharsis of pity and fear. The fear is the fear that, gee, I could do that, I could make that mistake, I get that. So you identify with the person in that situation. You fear for the fact that, oh my gosh, I could do that. And then you flush that out. And you're more inspired to live a more mindful life and to do something creative because you can see how destructive these emotions are when people act on them, how much harm gets done. Um, okay, there is, like all Greek educational texts, you start out in a world of appearances, and then you gradually you have this reversal and recognition. So either the characters go through a reversal or the audience goes through a reversal from appearance to reality, from happiness to unhappiness, or from ignorance to wisdom. And so uh, the Trojans at the beginning were wealthy, and Priam thought he could bribe off the Achaeans, and they ended up, of course, completely decimated. The Achaeans uh, started out, well, they start out fighting right from the beginning, but supposedly they win the war, but it's hardly uh, a victory celebration. I mean, first of all, they sack Troy and they act brutally, and then Agamemnon and Odysseus um, offer tribute to Athena before they head home because I think they're really worried about the great injustice they did, and so they have to try and appease her, which of course she's not fooled. But anyway, I think the story is that the audience really needs to gain the wisdom that it doesn't seem like very many of them had. Odysseus is the wisest. He's the one Athena is talking to. So there is a model. Another thing about the Greek texts is that you have an example of somebody who's better, the model to follow. I think Odysseus is the model to follow. And then, in relation to him, everybody else falters, is less just for various reasons and to various degrees. Then, the other thing that the play brings up is in terms of Aristotle's psychology, there's a lot of sensation, there's a lot of visual images, and there are also images of the integration of culture and nature. So the troops are described in relationship to the natural setting. They're, there's vivid descriptions of dawn, the dawn, the sun rising, and then perception and imagination, it triggers your imagination, and memory. One, so people can memorize the Iliad, but that's not what it's about. So then, in the in Aristotle's De Anima, he says, we have this. That's what we have in common with the animals. Animals have sensation, perception, imagination, memory, and their desires are tied to these things. But human beings also have art, so they make this transition to being able to see patterns. And that's the difference between memory and reminiscence. And once you are able to see the patterns, you can develop this deliberative imagination, the image of a person of practical wisdom, behaving mindfully, doing what's just in a variety of situations, and you can describe that, tie it to why, and that's how you get educated. So that's what he's trying to do. And then the metaphysics, the goal is that a person who's practically and theoretically wise, Odysseus, especially in Homer, is a microcosm in the macrocosm. He links culture and nature. He integrates culture and nature. And mostly he doesn't accept. He does. He makes a mistake. But the idea here is don't overreach, overstep your bounds. So hubris, I interpret that. I mean, again, my Greek friend said it really and technically just means swearing or something, being crude. But in the context, it's always going too far, going to an extreme. And that is violating your nature and violating the integration of nature and culture. And it's arrogant. You're not, because it's unwise, because the goal of wisdom is to be a microcosm in the macrocosm, to understand your place. So, hubris, I would say, would be stepping outside of your place, overreaching. And that's, boy, that's a theme throughout Homer. Um, all right, so the other, okay, so that's the way the poetics, the way it's organized, it follows these themes. The other thing is Aristotle's ethics. The characters definitely exercise the virtues and vices. So, temperance, self control in relationship to eating, for example. Um, there's constant reference to how to get the troops fed. It's just an issue when you're at war. And especially in the Odyssey, of course, Odysseus's men are intemperate and they eat at the wrong time and they eat and get the lotus eaters issue was a problem. And then when the cows of the sun, they were told not to eat those, and they did, and that was really a problem. So self control in relationship to eating. There are also vivid images of celebrations and feasts. They're not anti celebrating sensuality, it's when it goes to an extreme. Same with drinking. I mean, they would drink wine, but there are stories of people who got drunk, and those are clearly, that's barbaric, that's overreaching, and it creates trouble. And then, of course, sex is the worst. So that's how we got started with intemperance in relationship to sex. So Aristotle says the three most important virtues for political association are self-control, generosity, and courage. And these are the ones that the Iliad also represents, implicitly shows you that if you don't get those together, all the other things you do, your anger, your friendships, your deliberation process is totally corrupted if you are corrupted by pleasure, pain, or fear, or greed. Okay, so just to put it succinctly, the Iliad is a tale of two cities, and the Achaeans, right from the get-go, it's clear that they have power issues, and so they're the city that dedicated itself to power and lost track of the just cause, and they have all the problems that result from choosing the wrong goal. And the Trojans are clearly the city dedicated to pleasure and wealth. And Aristotle says there's three main choices in life. Paris's choices were either you go for power, status, or you go for pleasure and wealth, or you go for wisdom. So it's a tale of two cities. They're at two extremes, or the two choices you do not want to make. And then it shows you why you don't want to make those choices. It's a disaster for everybody. So everybody knows the story behind the Trojan War, that the gods were having a banquet. They did not want to invite Ursus, Strife. Now, this was a mistake because you don't like her because she causes trouble. The trouble is when you don't invite her, she really causes trouble. And so I think the message there is don't try to um, sentimentalize life. Don't try to put a veneer, pretend that it's one big happy. It's not. Life is difficult. Recognize it. Invite everybody to the banquet. Tell all the stories, which is what Homer does. He's telling you down and dirty every single way to go wrong. And if you remember, Hesiod has that image of the good ruler sitting on his throne, and the bards, the muses, are telling him all these stories about the way people go wrong, and it's because he knows those stories that he can judge correctly. Because even though he doesn't have personal experience, he has learned from the bards about all the foibles of humans, and then he can make a judgment about how to punish, how to rehabilitate, how to bring the city back into uh, equilibrium, and how to keep moving the city forward. So, so that Homer himself is telling his audience all these stories because he wants them to be better rulers. Um, okay, so that's the pleasure. The Trojans made that horrible mistake about pursuing pleasure, and the Chians pursued power. And then the other one is courage, and obviously the Iliad is filled with people trying to act courageously in situations involving fear, okay? Danger, um, danger of a early death in relationship to war, and then many other dangers, because war obviously puts you in an incredibly vulnerable situation. So people are afraid, or they have a lot to be afraid of. And so again, Aristotle distinguishes between different kinds of fear. Rational fear is to fear the right thing for the right reason, in the right way, at the right time, etc., etc., etc. And the things people fear aren't just death or pain, they also fear loss of reputation, social isolation, um, and clearly the characters in the Iliad fear that they would lose their reputations. They fear a lot of things other than just death. Um, okay, then the other kinds of courage, because none of them is acting for the right reason, none of them has rational courage. The second highest is citizen courage, and Aristotle defines as the courage of a citizen soldier who does what he's told, even though it's dangerous. And Aristotle says it's not rational courage because it has an ulterior motive, which is the desire for um, the external reward from your city, or the fear of being shamed, publicly shamed, or ostracized, whatever. So, a number of people in the Iliad have citizen courage, but they don't have rational courage. Um, then Aristotle, the two extremes are being rash, overreacting, or being a coward, underreacting. And so you have stories of people overreacting, underreacting. Achilles, in particular, is the most rash, and he overreacts. Um, and okay, so there's also the difference between courage and being high spirited, and Achilles is very high spirited, but people can be high spirited and still be willing to go out there and risk their lives, but they're wrong. It's for the wrong reason and the wrong way. Um, then Aristotle says confidence appears to be courage, but it isn't, or isn't usually, because sometimes people are confident because they're ignorant. They don't really know what they're getting in for. Other times they are professional soldiers who have already calculated that they're going to win this battle and they're not going to get hurt. That isn't real courage either. Real courage is that you're fighting for the right reason in the right way, and you will be willing to do whatever has to be done without committing a massacre, without any other ulterior motive, just in this case to preserve hospitality agreements, to preserve the rule of law, which should be the main motive in any war that's a just war. It's some reference to, if we don't preserve the sanctity of agreements, covenants, laws, and we can't have trust if states, nation states, city states cannot trust each other. Life is one big war. There's no security. So you have to, if somebody violates that, you have to fight back, so that there can be trust and goodwill between city-states or nations, because otherwise it's hopeless. We'll just kill each other till we're all dead. And then Aristotle also says that the person who is most likely as an adult to become courageous, rationally courageous, is a person who has high-spiritedness, but then you have to tie that down with reason. So if they can just tie it down with a mind so that they harness this high-spiritedness to fighting for the right reason in the right way at the right time, they can really be excellent military leaders, and they can strategize about how to maintain the rule of law with a minimum amount of death and destruction, with good strategy and perfect willingness, to do what's right. So that's what happened, is that Achilles had that potential, and the story of the Iliad is the story of how it was totally wasted, and he ended up doing a lot of destruction because Agamemnon, as a leader, could not educate him, and nobody else could, and he didn't seem interested in learning how to tie down his high-spiritedness, his natural virtue, with reason and mind. And Plato has that same character, Alcibiades, which I'll get to later. Okay, the third virtue is generosity, and that's the big problem with Priam, is that he comes from this wealthy city, and he makes a horrible mistake when he comes to the Achaeans. First of all, when Paris comes and he brings Helen, he lets Helen into the city. And the priests have said, don't do that. Give her back, because you're violating divine law. You're violating hospitality agreements that should be sacred. And Priam is an enabler to his son. Oh, my little boy, he should get the woman he wants. So he's a classic enabler. And then he blames Aphrodite. He tells Helen, oh, that's okay, Helen, it's all Aphrodite's fault. Again, that's not the way to do it. You would have wars forever. Marriage would have no sanctity. Every time any guy was tempted, he'd be able to go get who he wanted. This is a disaster. You can't run a city like this. This is one way that the rule of law gets destroyed and undermined, and people fall into a state of chaos. And then, to top that off, Priam goes to the Achaeans, and he tries to buy them off. He thinks being wealthy will protect him from any enemies, because he'll just pay them and buy them off. You can win hearts and minds with money, right? And it doesn't work. And not only that, but the Achaeans act very self-righteous. Like, oh no, we're not lowlife. we act on principle. We wouldn't give in to the low level of greed. Nestor gets completely outraged. He says, "Let's go kill every one of them," and Nestor overreacts because they end up doing that, and that was a massacre. So he should not have said that. The other irony is that at the end, when Priam comes to Achilles asking for Hector's body, he brings money, and Achilles takes the money. Like, you don't know if he's doing it just for the money, but he doesn't refuse the money. And so, all of that self righteousness on the part of the Achaeans turns out their big gun, Achilles, he'll take money. He doesn't have any shame, which is just awful. I mean, the whole thing is wonderful. To me, this is a classic, maybe the classic anti-war story. You can't get it more anti-war than this. Everybody's forgotten the point. Everybody sells out. Everybody breaks oaths and laws way more than Paris and Helen did, to much worse results. So what was the point of all that? It's war is stupid, and anyway, it's an anti-war story. So the next issue was anger, and so Homer says that the book is about Achilles' anger, and Achilles makes absolutely every mistake in the book. He his motives his motives are a great example of 50 ways to go wrong. Okay, so he is the best and brightest in the sense he is the one that could have led the Federation of Achaeans. He could have been a great ruler. Oh boy, at every step of the way, he not only blows it, he steps outside of the bounds, he commits hubris, and everybody suffers. So, how right from the beginning, he gets into Agamemnon gets into a power struggle with him and takes his woman, and Achilles runs to his mother. This is what Jung would call a mother complex. So there is all this stuff going on about the father complex and the mother complex. So he runs to his mother and tells his mother to tell Zeus to force the Achaeans to lose for a while, just to show Agamemnon that they can't win unless Achilles joins the battle. So it's all a matter of personal pride and of showing Achilles who's boss, and it's a good example of the relationship between the generations and the way the generations depend on each other, and they really ought to recognize this intergenerational dependence, and they ought to work together for a peaceful transfer of power as opposed to strife. So again, this goes back to Hesiod's theogony and the relationship between Uranos, Kronos, and Zeus, and the guys do it wrong, everything wrong. Well, Agamemnon's the same thing. He's in human form doing exactly that. He's getting himself into a power struggle with Achilles. In the case of war, in the days when wearing armor and all that, nowadays you don't have to have upper body strength or whatever, but the older people depended on the younger people. They were the boots on the ground. They were the ones that had to go out because they had the stamina to do it. And so they should have worked together. And the younger generation should have been able to trust the older generation that they wouldn't put them in harm's way unnecessarily. Nowadays, of course, we have the problem, is there trust? We definitely have an issue of class between the boots on the ground and the military brass who make the decisions. who are usually older, and the boots on the ground are usually younger. But again, the younger ones have to trust that the older ones are not going to take them into war just for power or just for money. Which, of course, yeah, sure, we don't do that anymore. Um, okay, so what were Achilles' motives when he finally decided to go into the war? Um, he didn't enter the war for a long time, a lot of killing, a lot of suffering, just to appease Achilles. He didn't care. He was so obsessed. This is the problem of identification with a complex. He had such a power complex and a father complex that he was obsessed with having power over Achilles and willing to let so many people suffer. Then he even let his friend Patroclus put on his armor and go suffer, and he died. All right. Achilles is shameless. But anyway, when he finally decides to go back to war, what are his reasons? Okay, he's shown Agamemnon that Agamemnon can't win without him. So might makes right. I mean, he's let Agamemnon know who's really in charge. He wants to show the Trojans, you don't kick Achaeans' butts. Um, Hector can kill Patroclus, but he will get his due. Nobody messes with us. He wants to take revenge. Um, and personal glory. All right. Now, when people are motivated by those four motives, power, status, personal glory, um, internal power issues within your own society, power issues between you and another country, or revenge, there will be perpetual war. It will never end because there's always a history of people harming each other. You can always find some excuse to call revenge. Then there's always, you can trump up uh, the foreigner as an enemy and create a war using political rhetoric. You can always create animosity between your country and other countries if your motive is to gain power over them or to gain personal glory or to make yourself look like a wonderful leader. So if you're motivated by that, the human condition is going to be one perpetual war. And Achilles is motivated by all four of them. Okay, the other thing he did is the first thing he did is he killed Polydora. He killed Priam and Hecuba's youngest son, which is really cruel in a monarchy because what he's trying to do is not only say, I'm going to defeat the Trojans, I don't want them to even have an inheritance. I want to destroy the monarchy. I want to destroy the the lifeblood of that society, which is really cruel. Because of course you have to have a male heir, and so by the first person you kill being the youngest male heir, what you're saying is, I don't want them to have a male heir, and then they will not have their monarchy anymore. Um, then, when he challenged Hector after Hector had killed Patroclus, Hector said, let's make an oath and agree that whoever dies, the other side can get the body so that it can be buried. And this is the most sacred oath or duty you have to the gods, is to bury a body. And Achilles refuses. This is so much more of a violation of sacred oaths than Paris, hospitality agreement. So Achilles violates a much more sacred covenant or oath. Then Achilles also, when he kills Hector, he desecrates Hector's body, which again is a huge violation in that culture. It just shows Achilles has no respect, no sense of humility before the gods or before men, or he doesn't care about anybody but himself. Completely overstepping the bounds. Then when he accepts Priam's money, he even goes for greed. Um, and at the very end of the Iliad, there's this kind of fatherly bond between Priam and Achilles, where Priam is weeping for his son, and Achilles can suddenly identify. Suddenly, some shred of humanity ekes out of Achilles. And I've heard people make a big deal out of that, like, oh, it's all resolved. It's like, it is not. To me, what that shows is the futility and stupidity of war, because these were the two guys, more than anyone else, that kept the war going and that led to all the problems. Now, of course, in any case of human affairs, there's more than one cause. So let me explain that. Okay, so Agamemnon started it. Fine, I agree with that. But Achilles, if he had not overreacted, it you would have had a stop to it. So it's called sufficient condition. Achilles could have prevented the stuff from happening. Same with Priam. I mean, Paris started it, but Priam could have said no, and it would have been the end of it. So these two guys who could have prevented everything, at the end, oh, you're a human being. Oh, really? And like, did you really have to kill all these people, all these innocent people, before it even dawned on you that the people you're dealing with are human and they have family bonds? So it's just so absurd. That's why I like it. I just read it as this anti-war story. That's the catharsis, right? The flushing out, the um, reversal and recognition from the appearance to the reality of the situation. That war requires people to demonize other people, and that's a complete lie about human life, that we basically have the same common humanity, and we really ought to solve our problems through negotiation and laws and agreements and compromises. And when we don't prove anything. We create more problems than we solve. Um, and then finally, with Achilles, um, when he decides he's going to go to war and kill Hector, he had to make a choice. His mother offered him. You can kill Hector, have glory, and die early, or you can live in obscurity and live a long life. So he chooses glory, right? A lot of people interpret that as, oh, see how great he is. No, no, he's not. I don't think that's the story. Because if he had chosen glory to kill Hector in the service of the just cause, and he had done it for the right reason, in the right way, at the right time, it's very possible that the Trojans would have given up a lot sooner if they didn't have Hector, because Hector was about all they had, and they couldn't have gotten very far without Hector. So Achilles could have focused on killing Hector. So the original dictum that if you kill Hector, you can have glory, yeah, under certain conditions, but not the way Achilles did it. He did it at the wrong time, for the wrong reason, in the wrong way. Everything was wrong. So, and then ultimately, in the Odyssey of all things, when Odysseus goes to Hades and sees Achilles. This is so crazy. Um, Odysseus, of all people, says to Achilles, "Oh, Achilles, the brave guy." Odysseus is the one that argued and argued with Achilles, told him to go to war, couldn't convince him. Um, the idea that Odysseus makes mistakes, and I think he made a huge mistake when he's telling Achilles that he's a great hero. And I think that's not an outrageous interpretation, because right at that point, Achilles, it's a reversal. Okay, so Odysseus, who usually gets it right, got it wrong. Achilles, who usually gets it wrong, got it right. And he said, "I'd rather be a farmer on earth than be Achilles in Hades, because I don't want to be dead. I hate being a shade. I want to get out there. I want to live. But I won't do anything unjustly." Well, okay. What is that? Let's unpack that. First of all, it's clear he made the wrong choice. It's okay to choose to live in obscurity, as long as it doesn't mean you have to be cowardly, right? If you happen to live at a time when you've got to go to war because of a hospitality agreement, you do your duty to preserve political association. If you don't have to, do not incite wars. Honor in war is not an end. If you happen to live at a time when you don't have to prove that, great. And don't overstep the bounds. Don't create animosity. Don't do anything that makes your own society less stable. And Achilles gets it. He gets that it's better to be alive. So I think that's the message, that Achilles is teaching Odysseus something, that Achilles' own craving for glory and his mistakes all the way along were a big mistake. But that was in the original oracle, or the original choice. He could have killed Hector justly, gotten the war over, and also lived a longer life, or died truly a hero. But instead, he chose to die after making all of these mistakes and doing everything wrong. And then he still wished he were back alive. He still wished he'd made the other choice, as long as I don't have to do anything unjust. And he didn't have to do any of those things. And everything he did was unjust. Um, so I think of it as an incredible example of reversal and recognition. And so what Homer is telling you, the story of the wrath of Achilles, is that here was this young man with all this potential, and uh, it just, his leaders, Agamemnon, incited him. He just went off, and everything fell apart. And it was the story of a great loss of potential and ability. And so it's a catharsis. It's, oh gosh, we could do that, I could do that. A fear, and flushing it out, saying, everything here is wrong, and we don't want to do this. It's an anti-war war story.